Chapter 1. Marie Antoinette's Bloody Petticoats. You are standing in the royal bedchamber of Versailles. The air is still thick with perfume that can quite mask the human smells trapped in the velvet drapes and rugs. A quiet hush hangs around the room, broken only by the subtle rustle of layered skirts being drawn aside, adjusted, fastened. The queen is bleeding. Marie Antoinette, glamorous, extravagant, famously detached from the commoners, is, at this moment, as mortal as any milkmaid in the village. She is menstruating, and Versailles, for all its chandeliers and cherub-painted ceilings, is not prepared for. Before we proceed, tell us your country. It helps us connect with our sleepy history lovers across the world. And don't forget to subscribe for more nighttime historical slowdown. It's 1774. Sanitary pads do not exist. Tampons are a century and a revolution away. There is no plastic, no elastic, no discreet wrappers, only linen, cotton, wool, and improvisation. It was a public protocol to be managed with silent grace, and Marie, she is barely 19, recently crowned Queen of France, and trapped in a cage of court etiquette, so suffocating it dictates how she is to sit, sleep, bathe, dress, and, yes, menstruate. The rituals of the royal flow. Every morning, the queen is dressed in a public ceremony known as the lever. Courtiers line up, jostling for the right to hand her a sleeve, a petticoat, a garter. But there is no allowance for modesty. Beneath her silk gowns, layers, panniers, corsets, stays, shifts, and beneath those, a rudimentary perhaps, a square of linen folded several times and tied between the legs with thin cords called sanitary belts. These cloths were rarely white. The white of innocence had no place in this process. Instead, darker fabrics and dyed linen or cotton absorbed the flow, changed often but not always thoroughly cleaned. Blood-stained cloths would be rinsed in cold water and hung to dry in hidden corners of the palace, where the servants called femmes de chambre, their silence and their distance. And yet, secrecy was a fantasy. The court of Versailles was a hive of gossip. Her monthly cycles were monitored, whispered about, charted not for health, but for politics. A missed period could mean an heir. A cramp could mean fertility trouble. A blood-stained petticoat, glimpsed by a maid, could mean rumors by evening and court scandal by dawn. The queen's chamber pot. There were no flushing toilets in Versailles. Waste was managed with a simple chamber pot, porcelain, ornate, occasionally covered in gold leaf, but still a bowl for bodily fluids. These were often emptied by servants in the early morning hours or in urgent moments, hidden behind the heavy drapes of the queen's private rooms. It's likely that when Marie Antoinette was menstruating, she relied on a combination of these pots, cloth rags, and periodic washes in a small basin of rosewater. Bathing was rare. Many believed too frequent washing could cause illness or affect fertility. Doctors of the time had theories. Menstrual blood was considered a form of bad humors leaving the body. It was thought to be dangerous, even poisonous. Men were warned to avoid a menstruating woman's gaze, let alone her bed. The king's duty to impregnate could override even biology. The petticoats, soiled and secret. Petticoats were worn in layers. The inner one closest to the body was often the victim. Though the cloth pads absorbed much of the flow, they leaked, strings broke, cotton shifted, and when it did, the blood left its mark. These inner garments were not laundered daily. Some were rinsed, others replaced, but the faint coppery stain often remained hidden unless lifted. In the hushed world of the queen's dressing room, It was the servants who saw it all and said nothing. Occasionally, Marie would request Perfumes lavender orange blossom, rose water sprayed not on her skin, but on her skirts. It wasn't luxury, it was necessity. The smell of menstrual blood, especially after hours in tight corsets and layered petticoats, was unmistakable. There were no deodorants, no antibacterial wipes, just centuries of expectation and a handful of petals pressed into a pouch. The bloodline. Marie Antoinette's period was not simply a matter of hygiene, it was a matter of empire. Her bleeding symbolized her fertility. Her fertility ensured a Bourbon heir. Every cramp, every late cycle, every month she bled without conceiving it, all meant something far beyond herself. Royal doctors tracked her cycles in private notebooks. Court gossipers tracked them with even more accuracy. There were months of silence followed by sighs of disappointment. Then came the pregnancies, the births, the daughters, then, finally, a son. But even after motherhood, the cycles returned, and so did the blood, the gossip, the linens to be boiled in secret, the petticoats to be discarded without explanation. Nothing to dispose in 18th century France. There was no such thing as disposable menstrual care. Everything was reused and reused. Pads were boiled in water, dried in shadowy corners of servant quarters, occasionally bleached in the sun, but never discarded lightly. For the queen, this meant trusting an invisible network of women to handle her most intimate business. Chambermaids, laundresses, wet nurses, handmaidens, all part of the menstrual machine of Versailles. These women were rarely named in records, but they ensured the queen bled in private. Silence and surveillance. Marie Antoinette was hated by the people long before the guillotine. Her extravagance, her aloofness, her famous apotherial or exaggerated made her a target. But her body and the bleeding of it was surveilled in ways no king would ever endure. She was watched not just for her words or her wardrobe, but for her womb. In this, her bleeding was not her own. It belonged to the monarchy, to France, to the history books. But behind the silk curtains, she bled, as all women, awkwardly, quietly, in pain, often soiling her sheets, often waiting for it to be over. The petticoats remain. No original petticoats of Marie Antoinette survive that contain menstrual stains, at least none on public display. But museum curators often speak of hidden garments, faded slips, yellowed linen that never quite lost their scent, silent relics of a woman who bled in lace. Her dresses are preserved. Her portraits live on. But her pads, her linens, her chamber pots, erased. Still, there is something quietly powerful about remembering her this way, not as a powdered queen who danced through roses, but as a human being managing her body beneath the weight of an empire. And so, as the candles burn low in the corridors of Versailles, and the air grows still once more, we are left with one last, unanswered question. What did her servants whisper to each other as they wrung out the queen's bloodied cloth in silence? Chapter 2. Theodora's Silken Rags. You are in Constantinople, 527 A.D. The rising sun reflects off golden domes and stone streets that still remember the dust of Rome. Here, behind the looming walls of the great palace, empresses bleed quietly, beneath robes of embroidered silk and imperial indifference. Theodora, once a lowly performer and later the most powerful woman in the Byzantine Empire, is sitting on a stool carved from marble, her back straight, eyes vacant. She is bleeding, not in battle, not in childbirth, just as all women do monthly, inconveniently, and always under surveillance. You wouldn't think an empress would be left to deal with her period in secrecy and silence. But this is not a time for open discussion. This is a time of modesty wrapped in layers of shame, secrecy, and ritual. And Theodora, despite her power, was no exception. The empress, who bled in silk, she was once a dancer, a street performer, an actress in the deepest sense of the word, meaning, at the time, almost synonymous with a prostitute. Yet through charm, intelligence, and political cunning, Theodora rose from the mud of the hippodrome to the jewel of the palace. But blood does not care for status. Each month it came, even as she sat beside Emperor Justinian, shaping imperial law, attending grand ceremonies, or directing the fate of court life. She bled, and the materials she had at her disposal. Nothing modern, not even the layered linen of the Renaissance queens. Theodora would have likely used tightly wound cloth rags, or possibly wool wads, changed frequently and washed by handmaids who were never to speak of it. Silk scraps, perhaps the remnants of discarded robes, may have served. Tied together with twine or singed into place using braided belts of linen. These were not sanitary, they were practical, or at least they tried to be. A city without soap. In 6th century Constantinople, hygiene was a strange mixture of luxury and limitation. Soap existed, but not the scented bars we know today. It was crude, often harsh, made from lye and fat, used more for scrubbing stains from tunics than cleansing a body. Instead, people preferred oils and scraping tools called sgiltses. Theodora may have rubbed perfumed oil into her skin, then scraped away sweat and residue with a curved blade. But this didn't help with menstruation. You couldn't scrape away blood. You couldn't perfume it either, though some tried. So Theodora, like all women of her time, would have developed a method. Washcloths soaked in vinegar, scented herbs tucked between the legs, dried moss wrapped in linen, perhaps even fine threads of silk twisted into primitive tampons. Though that is speculation, more myth than record. Yet, when you walk through the marble halls of the old palace in your mind and see her robes dragging along the mosaic floor, it is hard not to wonder. How often did she bleed through? The blood beneath the throne. Theodora ruled not as a consort, but as a co-regent. She issued orders, advised military campaigns, authored reforms that protected women and children. But none of this shielded her from biology. In her court, menstruation was a source of unspoken dread. The church at the time declared women unclean during their cycles. A menstruating woman could not enter the sanctuary. She could not touch holy relics. And yet Theodora, pious and political, was expected to smile, bow, appear at ceremonies, never once revealing her state. The palace tailors stitched extra layers into her garments. Her handmaidens carried folded cloths in hidden pouches. When accidents occurred, as they surely did, the stains were explained away as wine spills, dye leaks, or simply never mentioned. And when Theodora entered a room, no one asked, "Is she bleeding?" But many looked, quietly, curiously. The midwives' chamber. Byzantine medicine was deeply intertwined with superstition. Menstrual blood was believed to contain toxins, even magical properties. Physicians debated its role in balancing humors. Too much flow meant weakness. Too little meant hysteria. Midwives, often the only women trained in managing female bodies, handled menstrual hygiene discreetly. They would have instructed the Empress's household staff in rituals, cold compresses to stop heavy flow, wool soaked in vinegar to ease pain, or herbal teas made from mint, sage, or chamomile to regulate cycles. These practices did little to comfort Theodora during public events, when she was expected to wear heavy robes in sweltering heat, or sit for hours without adjusting her garments. Leaks were not only likely, they were inevitable, and yet no records of such embarrassments survive. Not because they didn't happen, but because history refused to record them. The blood of empresses didn't make the scrolls. Blood and power. What makes Theodora's menstruation so haunting is not its uniqueness, but its invisibility. She helped reform Byzantine laws on rape and forced prostitution. She protected young girls from being sold into brothels. She built institutions for poor women, and yet her own bodily pain was wrapped in shame, carefully excluded from her legacy. No chronicler dared note that an empress had to change her rags twice daily. No poet whispered about the blood hidden in the folds of imperial silk. No historian bothered to ask who washed her garments, who held the bowl of water she used to cleanse herself, who carried the basket of rags through the servant corridors. And still she bled. A palace without plumbing, the great palace of Constantinople, had aqueducts, bathhouses, and fountains. But plumbing, as we understand it, was a dream. There were no flush toilets, no running water in bedchambers. Waste was collected manually. Menstrual cloths were rinsed in cistern water, scrubbed by hand, and dried behind stone walls, where the scent of iron clung for days. Blood was hard to clean, wool clotted, linen stained, silk turned brown when dried. And yet, when Theodora, dressed in gold-threaded robes, and stepped onto the palace balcony to greet the people, her bleeding body was hidden beneath perfection, always hidden, always present. Final days, final flow, Theodora died younger, bound 48, possibly of cancer. Her legacy was monumental, her reign unforgettable, but her body, like all bodies, aged. Her cycles may have grown irregular, painful, erratic. Perhaps she welcomed menopause. Perhaps she feared it. There are no writings, no journals, no private confessions, but one can imagine the day it ended. A final cloth, a final stain, a final silence. She was free of it at last, and yet her entire reign had been shaped under its weight. And so, as the dust settles along the broken walls of the great palace, and night falls on the long-ruined throne room, you are left with this single, sleepy question. Did the silk she bled into survive longer than her name in the mouths of the women who washed it? Chapter 3. Elizabeth I and the lead-lined linen. You're in 16th century England, inside the walled gardens of Hampton Court. The air smells of damp stone and distant smoke. Somewhere, a lute plays a slow, lonesome song, and high above, in a tapestry-hung chamber filled with scented smoke and powdered wigs, Queen Elizabeth I is bleeding. The virgin queen head of state, icon of a golden age, mother to a nation but never to a child, is not spared by biology. Beneath the ruffs, the brocade, the impossibly stiff corsets, her body obeys its own clock, and right now her linen is soaked with blood, an image of power, a reality of blood. Elizabeth Tudor ruled for 44 years. She wore pearls to represent chastity, white paint to hide decay, and elaborate gowns that stiffened her into myth. But behind the myth, the human body endured. It bled, cramped, and stained. Each month, she withdrew, quietly, without explanation. There was no word like period. The court used terms like her courses or the flowers. But in the shadows of the royal dressing chamber, The women who attended her knew exactly what it meant. There was blood on the linen. Under the corset, Elizabeth's clothing was architecture. Her wardrobe included dozens of petticoats, farthingales, corsets reinforced with whalebone or metal, and layers of embroidered cloth. But what hid beneath all of that? Simple linen. When menstruating, Elizabeth would have worn an extra shifta, long undershirt, like garment, long with a cloth pad, possibly folded linen, fastened with ribbon or ties. There are accounts from the period describing the use of menstrual cloths held in place by belts or drawstrings. Some wealthier women even used thin rolls of linen, shaped and inserted like tampons, though this practice was rare and uncomfortable. Most relied on layers of absorbent, fabric washed, reused, and stained over time. Elizabeth had attendants, of course, gentlewomen of the privy chamber, whose duties included helping her dress, bathing her, combing her hair, and dealing with the silent labor of bodily maintenance. These women would rinse her cloths, pack them into storage, and burn any too soiled to recover. But the bleeding itself, that remained Elizabeth's own secret pain, a white face hiding red linen. Elizabeth was known for her lead-based cosmetic saw white paint made from ceruz, a combination of vinegar and white lead. It was deadly, but fashionable. It covered blemishes. It hid the pockmarks from smallpox. It created the illusion of purity immaculate, untouchable. But her inner garments told another story. Even the queen bled. And while her public face was smooth and pale, her private body was flushed and sore. She may have suffered from irregular periods. Stress, malnutrition, and disease often disrupted menstrual cycles. Some records suggest her periods stopped early, perhaps as young as her 30s, but while they lasted, the challenge remained. How to manage them in silence, under 1,000 watching eyes. Menstruation as a threat. In Elizabethan England, menstruation was taboo, mysterious, and widely misunderstood. Some physicians believed menstrual blood was toxic, capable of spoiling crops or killing small animals. Others claimed it was the body's way of purging evil humors. It was also tied to madness. Hysteria, melancholy, and even demonic possession were sometimes blamed on wandering wombs or retained blood. Elizabeth, who famously flew into rages and sometimes locked herself away for days, may have been reacting not to politics, but to cramps, migraines, or heavy bleeding. But to suggest such a thing in public would have been treason. A bleeding queen was a vulnerable queen, and Elizabeth knew this. She once said, "1,000 eyes look upon me, and I am but one woman." The royal wash. There were no hot showers, no modern baths. Bathing was rare and often discouraged for fear of spreading illness. Instead, Elizabeth would have used basins of warm water with herbs like lavender, chamomile, or rosemary. Cloths were dabbed, never rubbed. The act of cleansing was more ceremonial than effective. Her used menstrual rags were cleaned by hand, usually in cold water, to prevent staining. Vinegar or lye soap helped reduce odor. They were dried on wooden racks behind screens or fireplaces out of sight, but never quite out of smell. Some sources even mention rose petals or powdered clove sprinkled into garments to mask the scent. But blood has its own perfume, and in hot weather it was almost impossible to hide. A throne built on secrecy. The irony is not lost. The most powerful woman in England sat upon a throne, but also on a pile of blood-stained linen, carefully concealed. Every ambassador, courtier, and suitor scrutinized her body. They watched for signs of pregnancy. They counted days. they tracked when she appeared in court. But for Elizabeth, it meant crisis. So when the blood came month after month, it was relief and shame and proof that she remained a woman in full command, at least for now. No room for mistakes. Imagine being a servant who accidentally left a soiled cloth where it might be seen. Imagine being the one who discovered the queen had bled through her skirts before a public appearance. There were no second chances at court. The women who managed her menstrual needs were silent, efficient, invisible. Their labor is forgotten. Their names are unrecorded. But without them, the image of the Virgin Queen would have cracked under the very human truth of biology. The blood stops. Eventually, the blood ceased. It's believed Elizabeth entered menopause in her early 40s. After that, her court became even more obsessed with her aging face, her thinning hair, her fading fertility. But perhaps, in private, she was relieved. No more cramps, no more rags, no more worrying that a stain might betray her. And yet, the ghost of those years remained. She died in her 60s. Her body, when prepared for burial, revealed the scars of royal life. Her teeth had rotted. Her hair had fallen out. Her skin was scarred from cosmetics. But there's no mention of the linen, of the rags, of the blood that was erased. And so, as the candlelight flickers on the worn stone walls of Hampton Court, and the soft rustle of farthingale and silk fades into sleep, one question lingers in the stillness. Did the Virgin Queen ever look at her stained linen and wonder what it would have meant to bleed for something other than duty? Chapter 4. Cleopatra's Papyrus Plugs. Asterisk, asterisk, let your body sink a little deeper. The Nile flows outside the palace walls, and torches flicker against columns painted with sacred lotuses. You're in a room of polished alabaster, draped in linen, so thin it breathes with the night, and somewhere behind those veils, Cleopatra bleeds. Not the Cleopatra you know, the seductress painted in gold leaf and scandal, but the woman who had to sit quietly during royal audiences while the inner workings of her body pushed blood through her legs. A queen who mastered politics and poison, war and empire, but could not halt the tides within her own uterus. The pain was private, the solutions primitive and perfumed. Cleopatra lived in a time when menstruation was wrapped in silence and soaked into cloth. In ancient Egypt, medical papyri spoke of the monthly blood in passing, as if it were an annoying side note to fertility, childbirth, or curses. The women of her court likely passed knowledge down woman to woman, midwife to maidservant, never writing it down. Yet for someone like Cleopatra, who ruled not just a kingdom, but an image, these things mattered. She could not bleed onto marble. She could not be seen soaking linens in public baths. She had to hide it all, and hide it elegantly. Her solution, papyrus, the same plant that gave us scrolls and scripture, was also shaped, softened, and twisted into a primitive kind of tampon, not rolled like the ones we know today, but rather formed into plugs, small enough to insert and absorb, large enough to stay in place with effort. Sometimes the papyrus was soaked in honey or resin, both as a natural antibacterial and a makeshift adhesive. There are fragments of medical records, some in hieroglyphs, some scratched into clay, that speak of inserting fibrous matter into the female passage. It was clinical, it was painful, and it was normal. Cleopatra's plugs would not have come pre-wrapped. They were handmade, possibly by female servants trained in such crafts. Linen scraps were precious. Papyrus was a compromise between availability and discretion. The fibers were softened by soaking, sometimes treated with oil or animal fat. Once inserted, the discomfort must have been constant. No one speaks of how it felt, but one can imagine beneath layers of linen dresses, beneath a throne of ivory, and gold Cleopatra clenching her muscles, holding it all in. Dignity was a discipline. And then there was the smell, the heat of Alexandria, combined with the natural rot of blood and fiber, required masking. Perfumes were not a luxury in Cleopatra's world. They were necessity. Frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon oil. Blue lotus. It was common to burn scented cones on the head, to crush petals into oil and smear them into the folds of clothing and skin. But in this context, the perfume was defensive. Papyrus absorbs not only blood but odor, and so it had to be drenched. And yet, as the scent faded, it turned sour. Musk mingled with menstrual iron. Cleopatra walked through crowds that bowed to her scent. Not knowing what it hid, she could not change plugs often. There was no privacy. Baths were communal, chamber pots shared with servants. Her menstruation had to be controlled, like a campaign. Some sources suggest women in ancient Egypt used pessaries, vaginal suppositories, made from crocodile dung or acacia resin for contraception. It's possible that such concoctions also served to tighten the vaginal walls or create a seal, holding the papyrus in place. Imagine that bleeding into a bloodied scroll, sealed with feces and scented with roses. The Egyptian climate dried the blood quickly, which helped, but dryness was not the same as cleanliness. Infections were common. It's likely that Cleopatra suffered from recurring pelvic discomforts, though she would never speak of them. Doctors of the time believed in balancing the humor's blood. Bile phlegm menstruation was considered one of the ways to purge excess. Some even believed that stopping menstruation was fatal. Others thought a menstruating woman could sour wine, wilt flowers, or blunt a blade. This is the world in which she ruled. While Roman envoys negotiated trade, Cleopatra negotiated with her own body. Blood dripping in silence, the fibers of a plant keeping her dignified. In her private chambers, maybe there was a slave girl who helped her wash. Maybe there were bowls of warm water and linen rags, stained dark red, soaking beside perfumes. The contrast is hard to imagine. A woman worshipped as a goddess, clutching her lower belly in pain, wincing as another plug was twisted in. The historical silence around menstruation is perhaps loudest here. In a world where Cleopatra's every affair was mythologized, her bleeding remains unspoken. Artists painted her reclining in robes, being unwrapped like treasure. No one painted the stains. No one spoke of the cramps that curled her into sleep. Her uterus bore children, hosted Caesar's bloodline, negotiated with Antony's lust, but its monthly blood was an embarrassment. So she hid it in papyrus and scented oils. At night, she likely slept on her side, linen sheets beneath her hips. Just in case the plug failed, the blood of queens was not allowed to touch the floor. The image of Cleopatra has been twisted by centuries of retelling. But she was not just lover, ruler, goddess. She was a woman who bled like any other. Everything was watched, and everything smelled of honey and heat. Sleep now, if you can. The Nile still flows. The torches are out. And somewhere in the shadows of history, a queen folds her legs, closes her eyes, and tries not to stain the silk. Chapter 5. Catherine de Medici's Crimson Perfumes. Asterisk, asterisk. The court of 16th century France did not smell of roses. It smelled of rot beneath roses. Perfume, heavy and violent, clung to every hem, sleeve, and breath like armor, and no one wore it more viciously than Catherine de Medici, the Italian-born queen consort who would become regent and political puppeteer behind France's bloodiest years, was also, quietly, a woman constantly at war with her own flesh. She bled like the rest of them, but Catherine, unlike Cleopatra, lived in a world where religion declared menstruation unclean, and the court whispered that a bleeding woman could curse a crown. So she hid it, not just behind doors, but behind fragrance. She soaked herself in, sent to drown the smell of iron rot and the slow decay of royal hygiene. In her private chambers, more chemistry lab than bedroom, Catherine was said to concoct her own perfumes. Ambergris, civet, musk, and rose oil were ground and stirred, not just to seduce, but to cloak. She didn't want to be smelled when she bled. She didn't want courtiers catching the faintest trace of what leaked beneath her skirts. She wore corsets, so tightly wound that they forced the blood to stay low, pressing downward, trapping it. Her linen underlayers, stained monthly, were often buried under layers of lace and velvet, and when it soaked through us, it sometimes did she would retreat and change, silently, without calling for maids. Some sources whisper she even developed a formula of rose water and mercury to apply directly to her inner thighs, numbing scent and sensation alike. Her servants were trained not to speak of it. Her laundresses, if they found evidence, were paid to look away. And the court poets, those mouthpieces of power, would write of her brilliance, her cruelty, her political cunning, but never once her blood. What was unspoken became perfume. Every bottle on her vanity hid a memory. Every dab behind her ear drowned a secret. In a world that feared the smell of women, Catherine turned it into a weapon. She overpowered it, layered it. She wore her blood like a hidden dagger, concealed in scent, masked in musk. The queen never allowed the natural to escape. Not even the wind carried her truth. And yet, beneath all that perfume, beneath all that silk, Catherine bled quietly, monthly, in crimson silence. Chapter 6. Noor Jahan's rose-soaked cloths, asterisk, asterisk, in the perfumed haze of the Mughal court, where marble walls echoed the delicate sound of sitars and courtyards bloomed with fountains of rosewater, lived a woman whose name would dissolve boundaries between legend and rule, Noor Jahanlight. But even the most luminous woman of her age bled in the shadows of her palace, and even she had to find a way to soak up the truth of her body without disrupting the illusion of power. Hygiene was ritual in the Mughal Zenanatha secluded women's quarters. Everything from bathing to scenting linens was part of a calculated performance of elegance. Noor Jahan, more than any royal woman of her era, elevated that performance into something nearly sacred. She is often remembered for her love of roses, distilling their essence into oils, decorating her garments with their soft petals, and even using rosewater as political currency when entertaining foreign emissaries. But her fondness for the flower was more than aesthetic, it was practical, because the stench of blood had no place in a room built for pleasure. Her menstrual cloths, linen strips, and swaths of finely woven muslin were said to be soaked in rosewater before use. They were washed, dried, then soaked again. The scent did not merely perfume the fabric. It masked the metallic odor that leaked from between her legs each month. These cloths were folded and stored in carved sandalwood boxes in hidden compartments of her private quarters. They were not to be touched by anyone but her most loyal attendants, and those women swore silence with their lives. The scent of roses became her shield, and menstruation was quietly reduced to a monthly chore one that left no stain on marble floors or silk cushions. In a culture where cleanliness was both religious and political, Noor Jahan was a master of concealment. Bathing during menstruation was not just a relief, but a ritual. She would immerse herself in scented waters, throws, jasmine, vetiver till her skin no longer smelled of the body, but of a garden in bloom. The water turned pink with the blood she shed, but no one saw it except the woman who scrubbed the basin afterward in silence. Noor Jahan is remembered for her innovations in textile and design, but rarely does anyone speak of the intimate textiles she used to absorb, the most human part of her life. Her personal hygiene routine was a careful ballet of concealment and control. While she ruled from behind a veil, she bled into cloths soaked in flowers. The empire may have smelled roses, but beneath it all was the slow, inevitable rhythm of a body she could not escape. And yet, there is something deeply human, something disturbingly mundane about the image of the Empress inspecting her cloths each morning, staining them red, then wrapping them, pressing them to herself as she reviewed messages from distant provinces, listened to poetry, issued orders. Her empire bled under her rule, and so did she quietly, cleanly, behind a veil of roses. Chapter 7. Catherine the Great's Ice-Cold Monthlies. ****. Before we begin, tell us in the comments from which country are you watching. We love knowing where this slow drift through history finds its listeners. If you find these quiet stories soothing, subscribing helps keep the channel alive and the tales coming. Now, imagine the vast, cold expanse of 18th century Russia. The snow crunches beneath horse hooves, the wind cuts like a blade through layers of velvet and fur, and inside the grand halls of the Winter Palace, the air is thick with candle smoke and whispers. Among the towering columns and gilded mirrors sits a woman both feared and admired. Catherine the Great. Catherine, born Sophia of Anhalt-Zerbst, rose from a minor German princess to Empress of Russia through a mix of luck, ruthlessness, and sheer force of will. She ruled an empire stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, a world as vast and unpredictable as the tundra beyond her palace walls. But beneath all her power, beneath the jewels and velvet gowns, she was still subject to the monthly intruder known as menstruation. In Russia's bitter winters, managing periods was a matter of survival as much as secrecy. The cold was relentless, and warmth was scarce even in the palace. There were no disposable products, no modern pads or tampons. Instead, Catherine relied on methods that combined the biting chill of her homeland with what resources she could command. It is said she used cloths soaked in ice water to cool the burning pain of cramps, wrapping them tightly against her skin. The cold numbed the discomfort, slowed the flow, and gave her some relief from the relentless ache. These ice-cold monthlies were as much a practical remedy as a ritual, repeated quietly in her chambers where no servant dared intrude. Menstrual cloths were thick linen rags, layered and folded, soaked and then wrung dry before use. She was known to order her laundresses to wash these cloths in cold water mixed with herbs mint, sage, and sometimes juniper to mask the scent and prevent infection. But the chill was ever present. The cold water was believed to shrink womb and stop excess bleeding. Such remedies were common in 18th century Europe. But for Catherine, they took on an almost symbolic meaning. Her ice-cold compresses mirrored her famously cool demeanor in politics, her sharp mind that cut through opposition like a frozen blade. Her body's pain was battled with ice as much as her enemies were battled with cunning. The Empress also adopted strict schedules around her menstrual cycle. Court documents reveal that she often secluded herself during the troublesome days, avoiding public audiences and formal ceremonies. These absences were carefully explained as bouts of ill health, but they concealed the slow bleed that drained her strength despite her power. Catherine was never free from the limitations of her body. She could issue edicts and expand empires, but she could not halt the biological rhythms that shaped her life. The iciness of her menstrual care was both a practical adaptation and a metaphor for her non-yielding, sharp, and endlessly controlled. When you picture her seated on the throne, her skirts folded and the palace lit with the cold blue light of winter, imagine the heavy linen wrapped beneath her robes, the cold compress pressed to her abdomen, and the silent endurance of a woman who ruled a vast empire while battling the slow, invisible flow of blood. The months passed, empires rose and fell, but the ice remained constant, cruel, and necessary. Chapter 8. The Empress's Blood in Byzantium, ***. Now, picture Constantinople, the grand capital of Byzantium, a city of marble columns, soaring domes, and echoing prayers. In the heart of the imperial palace, an empress wrapped in silks prepares herself for the day, her face serene, but her body betraying the natural cycles that no crown could command. The Byzantine empress, no matter how powerful, was still a woman tied to the rhythms of blood and time. Menstruation was a hidden reality, an inconvenient truth that royal protocol demanded be concealed at all costs. To menstruate was to risk being labeled impure, unfit for prayer, and vulnerable before enemies. Empresses relied on layers of linen, pads, sometimes soaked in fragrant oils or vinegar to mask the odor. These cloths were folded and tied with ribbons or fastened with belts, changed in secret chambers, far from prying eyes. Some women in Byzantium used wool pads, believing that the natural lanolin helped prevent infection, though wool had the drawback of retaining moisture and warmth, increasing discomfort. There was also a prevailing belief that menstrual blood could carry disease or curse objects it touched. As a result, empresses' menstrual cloths were often burned or buried, and their laundry was handled only by trusted servants sworn to silence. The blood was a dangerous secret. Byzantine medical texts offer some advice: cold compresses to reduce swelling, herbal infusions to soothe cramps, and even enemas to cleanse the body. Yet, despite these treatments, many women likely suffered in silence. The empress's menstrual cycle was also politically sensitive. It was considered a bad omen if she menstruated during religious festivals or important ceremonies. For this reason, some empresses fasted or altered their diets to delay or suppress their periods, though with unpredictable results, behind the glittering walls of the palace. The Empress's blood was both a private burden and a symbol of vulnerability. Her attendants managed the mess with practiced discretion, aware that any slip could threaten the dignity of the crown. And while official portraits showed a flawless, serene woman, the reality was that the Empress lived with pain, secret changes of stained cloths, and the fear of discovery as the church bells tolled and the city bustled beyond palace walls. The Empress faced the same challenge as all women before her, to bleed in silence and maintain the illusion of eternal strength. Chapter 9, Queen Victoria's Wool Woes, ***, the image of Queen Victoria has always been stitched into the British imagination with lace and loyalty, mourning veils, and maternal monarchism. But beneath the corsets and crinolines, under the weight of etiquette and empire, something far more intimate was being endured, month after month, in quiet discomfort. For even the longest reigning Queen of England, the woman who gave her name to an entire era, could not escape the biological cadence of menstruation, and her chosen remedy was wool, thick, absorbent, itchy wool. It sounds almost fictional in its abrasiveness, but the reality was as raw as the textile. Victorian attitudes toward menstruation were cloaked in silence and shame, even among queens. There were no commercial sanitary products in the early 1800s. There were no discreet, disposable solutions. There were cloths, rags, safety pins, in Victoria's case, tightly packed pads made of raw wool, layered and folded, and placed with a kind of resigned regality between her petticoats and skin. They were reused, washed in cold water to avoid staining, and hung in secret places to dry out of sight. The Queen's maids knew the schedule. The laundresses bore the burden, and the wool damp, heavy, and ever scented with iron, was always there. Wool, of course, was chosen for its absorbency, but its drawbacks were legion. It irritated the skin. It harbored heat and moisture. It left behind a faint fuzz that clung to the body long after the pad had been removed. And in winter, it chilled. It didn't insulate when wet. It clung coldly to flesh, leaching warmth and replacing it with a damp reminder of the Queen's private affliction. On some days, Victoria's underlayers must have felt more like wet rags than royal protection. There were no elastic bands hold the pads in place. Instead, Victorian women, including the Queen, used belts, cloth belts with button fastenings, or rudimentary ties. Sanitary belts, as they would later be called, were crude, harnesses, thin ribbons of fabric meant to hold the woolen pad against the body, suspended in place like a delicate gag. The system worked, barely. Pads slipped, they bunched, and when they leaked, there was no stain remover discreet enough for the royal laundries to mask the proof. Victoria, who bore 9 children and ruled over continents, still found herself shackled monthly to these woolen woes. Even in her journals, which detail everything from her childbirths to her daily walks, there is no direct mention of menstruation. It was too shameful, to taboo and uncleanliness, not to be named. But the laundry records show the rhythm. So do the expenses, quietly noting the purchase of flannel cloths and absorbent linens. Behind the veils and black bombazine, behind the stiff postures and endless portraits, there was blood. Always blood. Medical advice of the time didn't help. Physicians viewed menstruation as a weakening illness, one that justified rest, but also reinforced the belief in female fragility. For a queen, this translated into isolation. On those days, her schedule might mysteriously clear. Audiences postponed, letters unanswered. She might take to her private sitting room, windows drawn, woolen pad in place, cramping silently as the palace bustled around her. No one would speak of it, but everyone knew the wool was not only uncomfortable, it was symbolic. It represented the refusal to innovate for women. It was what women were expected to endure: scratchy, red, reusable silence. Victoria, with all her power, did not change the system. She accepted it, just as countless working-class women did, though. Their pads were often made from even coarser materials: old towels, torn skirts, strips of mattress ticking. Wool, for them, was a luxury. For the queen, it was just another crown she wore in secret. Even in death, her relationship to these things was guarded. When her undergarments were inventoried posthumously, her menstrual cloths were burned. Number, relics, no proof. Only the memory of discomfort, passed down in whispers and footnotes. In stories of royal maids who could not meet the eyes of those they served when delivering the queen's soiled cloth to the fire, so the woman who ruled an empire still bled each month in silence, strapped into her woolen belts and mourning her discomfort as much as she mourned her late husband. The monarchy marched on. The empire expanded. The world industrialized. But in the queen's chambers, her wool remained unchanged antiche, blood-stained monument to an age that preferred propriety over progress. And thus her legacy was stitched, not just into flags and treaties, but into every unseen fiber of her monthly suffering, each strand of wool heavy with the weight of history, secrecy, and enduring pain. Chapter 10. Japanese Empress and Rice-Starch Pads. Asterisk, asterisk. She sat beneath the flicker of a candle shaped like a lotus flower, its flame wavering in the stale air of a room perfumed with camellia oil and slow, thick silence. Her robes, layered in such precise mathematical folds that they whispered rather than rustled, weighed heavily on her thighs. The hour was late, and her attendants had long since fallen into stillness beyond the silk screens. In this quiet, the Empress reached between her legs, feeling the damp persistence of her body's rhythms, the eternal reminder that beneath her painted serenity, she bled like any other woman. Unlike the palace concubines or the women who walked barefoot in the rice fields, the Empress of Japan could not be seen to menstruate. Her pain must be fragrant, her flow invisible. This was not the era of convenience or cotton. This was the Heian court 1,000 years ago, when courtly elegance meant hiding even the most basic bodily truths beneath 30 layers of silence. She did not speak of her monthlies, but the women who served her knew. They knew by the faint smell of starch and body heat. Her solution was rice, not the grain, but the starch it birthed, a thick, milky white paste boiled from leftover water. Of the royal kitchen's daily batches, from this fluid, her women would knead pads of soft silk cloth, treated again and again with the starchy solution until it hardened slightly, forming a porous, absorbent layer between layers of soft, aged fabric. These were her pads, delicate as paper, rigid at the edges, and far too absorbent for the fragile silks they were often tucked between. They were tied with red-dyed cords around the waist and between the thighs. Sometimes they leaked anyway. Sometimes she bled through 4 layers of kimonos. And always she bled in silence. The starch had a cloying scent when warm, something between sweet rot and steamed linen. And in the depths of summer, when the Kyoto heat pressed against her spine like a damp animal, the smell of it mixed with sweat and blood. The ladies of her court would pretend not to notice. They sat beside her, sleeves trailing like ivy, writing poems about the moon and the melancholy of withered plum blossoms, even as the Empress discreetly shifted, feeling the stickiness bloom through her inner layers. Cleaning these pads was a ceremony in itself. Once used, they were not thrown away. No, the Empress's blood was sacred, a manifestation of life, power, and womanhood. Her attendants would gather the stained rice-starch cloths in lacquered trays and carry them to private quarters, where elderly women boiled them again and again in salted water. The smell that rose from these pots was not the sweet perfume of cherry blossoms. It was bodily, earthy, metallic, and it never entirely went away. Sometimes these cloths tore. Sometimes they left crumbs of starch embedded against her skin. Sometimes the starch hardened too soon, causing irritation and cold rashes that spread along her thighs. There were no ointments. There were only powders made of crushed pearls, which soothed nothing but gave the illusion of care. There are records, sparse, careful, evasive, that mention moist compresses and seasonal afflictions in the Empress's diaries, always written in her hand with ink as fine as hair. But nowhere does she say blood. Nowhere does she say pain. The most intimate detail permitted was that her women used to offer her pickled plums during those days, knowing her appetite grew sour with the flow. And what of disposal? When a pad was finally too fragile to be used again, torn at the edges, its starch coming loose in flakes, it was not discarded like a peasant's rag. It was burned, not in the open, but in a secret brazier behind the prayer chamber, where a monk whispered sutras to guide even this small fragment of royal flesh into the afterlife. Ashes of blood mixed with incense. The Empress would never speak of these rituals. To bleed was to be human. To rule she could not be. And so the rice-starch pads became her silent attendants, soaking up what she could not voice, bearing what no poem would ever confess. Chapter 11. Bourbon Bloodlines and Bloodstained Bedsheets. Asterisk, asterisk, the Bourbon dynasty prided itself on ceremony. Every waking breath of its queens was measured by rituals, gilded mirrors, and the gaze of 1,000 servants whose job was to pretend, not to notice. But there was one thing Versailles could never master: the discreet, quiet reality of menstrual blood. Beneath the lace and rouge, behind the diamond-drenched drapery, was a human body performing its biological burden, one linen sheet at a time. Menstruation was not a subject for courtly conversation, but the palace spoke in fabric. The laundresses of Versailles, silent, bent-backed women, were the true chroniclers of royal cycles. They knew which bedsheets came soaked in shame. Blood left trails long before gossip did. They soaked the royal linens in lye and lime, scrubbed the red out of embroidered monograms, and hung the truth out to dry on thick ropes behind the kitchens. The sun and the wind were their accomplices. But some stains, quite literally, never came out. The young queens of France, Marie Therese, Marie Lacheska, and the doomed Marie Antoinette, all learned to smile through their cycles. There was no privacy in the royal bedchamber, no velvet excuse to rest. Even the act of waking up bled into spectacle, a public rising, an audience to dress, to eat, to breathe, and to conceal. When the time came each month, the court expected the queen to pretend it wasn't happening. But her body did not bow to etiquette. It stained. They used cotton when they could, linen when they must. But before the advent of sewn pads, most queens simply folded cloths, thick, white, absorbent, and alarmingly visible beneath the paper-thin muslin gowns of the time. These cloths had to be changed frequently, often in secret, often while standing. Toilets in Versailles were few and hardly private. Chamber pots had to suffice. But what does one do with a bloodied rag when dozens of courtiers trail behind your every move? The answer: discard them, hide them, burn them. Some were flushed with watered-down secret latrines. Others balled up and dropped into the waiting hands of ladies' maids. Many were tossed behind tapestries. Sometimes the same cloths were reused for days, washed poorly, worn again. The scent of perfume became not a luxury, but a necessity. Tuberose and ambergris masked the scent of iron. Court life was one long olfactory duel with the truth. Then came the pregnancies. They were not private affairs. Royal wombs were not personal property. They belonged to France. Every sign of missed blood was celebrated with wine-soaked breath and fear. Every return of it marked political failure. The queens were watched not for who they were, but for what bled out of them or didn't. The state had its hand in their undergarments, its eyes in their bedsheets, and the blood never ceased to tell its story. There were rumors about miscarriages disguised as menstruation, about sudden floods in the night, about linens taken by midwives and never returned, about long trails of blood from the queen's chamber to the laundress's quarters. The bedsheets were soaked in more than bodily fluid. They carried the weight of succession, of fear, of legacy. Every spot of red was both intimate and political. There were days, toward the end, when Marie Antoinette stood still too long, and something leaked down her thigh. The ladies in waiting knew what to do. They carried perfumes, handkerchiefs, and distractions. The ritual of concealment had become sacred. The Bourbon queen had no time to bleed, but her sheets always did, and the beds, grand as they were, remembered it all. The canopied frames, the tapestries, the feathers and brocade, the mattresses stuffed with straw. Underneath them all, thin layers of oiled cloth tried to stop the blood from seeping in. It rarely worked. Beneath the sheets of Versailles was a permanent stain of blood, of lineage, of womanhood denied dignity in the name of sovereignty. In the end, it was not politics that unraveled the Bourbon mystique. It was the slow, unrelenting human truths that queens bled, that cloths stained, and that no amount of perfume could erase the body's refusal to be forgotten. Beneath the silks and crowns, there were always blood-stained bedsheets, whispering the truth Versailles refused to see. Chapter 12. Ottoman Queens and the Hammam Myths. Asterisk, asterisk, the marble sweats, though it is stone. Heat rises in slow, thick coils from the floors of the palace hammams, heavy with centuries of vaporized secrets. Somewhere behind the latticework of gold-leafed windows and pearl-inlaid doorways, Ottoman queens once laid their aching bodies down on stone slabs bare, bleeding, regal, but not clean, not really. There is a myth that cleanliness was next to godliness in the Ottoman court, especially for its women. To the outsider, it appeared so. Lavish marble baths carved from Anatolian quarries, rows of eunuchs guarding every steam-filled threshold, jasmine, oil, rosewater, sandalwood, paste. The women scrubbed until their skin peeled like fruit, the stories say. But in the folds of ritual and behind the grand illusion of hammam hygiene, menstruation was an unruly, private theater of discomfort. For the imperial consorts, concubines, and queens of the harem, monthly bleeding was not just a nuisance, it was a political liability. In a system where fertility could crown a woman with influence or erase her entirely from palace memory, menstruation was both a marker of potential and a stain to be concealed. The hammam wasn't merely a place for bathing, it became a stage for hiding. The odor of sweat, steam, and musk disguised the sour copper of blood. But there was no sanitary bin, no sterile gauze. There were only layers of cotton, woven tight and stuffed deep. The preferred method involved cotton pads, often reused, rinsed poorly in the corner basins of the hammam. They were wrung by hand, hung to dry in private alcoves, and folded again into the linen drawers of women waiting their turn. Stains were common, infections more so. Yet these women were supposed to smell like rose petals. They were meant to be desirable, even as their wombs turned against their composure. The hammam was a place of purification, but no ritual could drain the embarrassment of a leak spotted by an attendant or a rival consort. The social order of the harem was a ruthless geometry one. Red drop in the wrong place could tilt everything, and so myths were born. That the hammam cleansed all impurities, that the queens were untouched by such base functions, that Ottoman women were paragons of perfumed chastity. These were polite fictions repeated by travelers and diplomats who never saw the dried blood crusted in the grooves between floor tiles. They never heard the whispers of women who feared not the flow itself, but what it meant: a temporary exile from the bed of the sultan, from influence, from the fragile favor that protected them. The steam made everything seem soft and distant. But time did not fog the memory of stained underlayers and shared cloths. The hammam offered illusion, not escape. The Ottoman queens bled like any other women, but with the added weight of being forbidden to show it. They left behind no journals, no frank letters about their monthlies, only the silence of stone and the faint, lingering musk of a place where bodies were never allowed to simply be bodies. Chapter 13. Anne of Austria's Hidden Flow. Asterisk, asterisk, she was a queen who wore veils not just on her face, but across her life. Opaque, thick, deliberate. Anne of Austria, Queen of France, and mother to the Sun King, Louis XIV, was an emblem of courtly chastity wrapped in political theater. And as was often the case with women in power, her body was more scrutinized than her policies, especially the parts of her body that bled quietly once a month. In the 17th century, menstrual hygiene remained a wholly private ordeal, masked by etiquette, crushed beneath corsets, and muffled by layers of brocade and Catholic guilt. For Anne, born into the Spanish Habsburg court and married into the French one, the tension between public decorum and private biology was relentless. She was expected to represent dynastic purity while managing a body that reminded everyone, monthly, of its raw femaleness, so she hid it. literally. Unlike some royal women who embraced medicinal rituals or perfumed cloths, Anne's menstrual management strategy was one of concealment. Her ladies-in-waiting were sworn to absolute silence. She wore thick underskirts, many of them woven from layers of wool, silk, and linen that served not only as insulation against French winters, but as an absorbent shield. It was rumored in court gossip that Anne would wear night skirts. During her period, long quilted petticoats that were heavier than usual, layered with cloth padding underneath. These were changed in secret, in rooms with bolted doors, and no men permitted inside. Some whispered that she used bundles of soft rags, wrapped tightly with cord and placed between her legs, not so different from the medieval cloths used by her predecessors. These pads were said to be boiled in rose water afterward and reused. Servants assigned to launder these items were selected carefully, often older women with no ties to the gossipy upper staff. No handmaiden of hers would dare mention the citor, smell of blood. It was understood Anne's flow did not exist. During long processions or diplomatic journeys, when access to her private chambers was limited, she reportedly used custom-sewn cloth undergarments, thickly stuffed and changed as discreetly as possible. Her presence, at all times, had to remain immaculate. The queen did not bleed. The queen was not subject to the crude rhythms of common women. At the height of her infertility crisis, years into her marriage to Louis XIII, without producing an heir, the subject of Anne's menstruation became, perversely, a matter of state interest. Doctors speculated in hushed voices. Did she bleed regularly? Was her cycle normal? Was her womb open or closed? The royal council did not hesitate to meddle. Confessors, midwives, and even foreign ambassadors weighed in. A queen who bled was a queen who might bear sons, but it remained her burden to suffer it out of sight. After her eventual pregnancy and the birth of Louis XIV, some believed Anne's relationship with her own body softened, but her hygiene habits remained rigid. She continued to conceal her menstruation even from her own son, who would grow up to demand loyalty, display, and cleanliness from every corner of his court. He may have been the Sun King, but Anne had learned long before him how to orbit power quietly, with veiled pain and hidden rags tucked beneath her gowns. The linens she bled on, the skirts she changed, and the pain she buried were all part of the invisible labor that came with being a royal woman. Anne of Austria's flow was not a secret because it was shameful. It was a secret because the world insisted it shouldn't exist at all. No one would ever find her blood, but it was thereon the throne, in the sheets, in the silence.